Camden, Maine, October 1990, a coastal town where autumn painted the hills in brilliant reds and oranges, where fishing boats returned to harbor each evening, and where fog rolled in from Penobscot Bay, creating an atmosphere of mystery and beauty. Rebecca Hayes lived on Elm Street in a white colonial house 3 blocks from Camden Hills High School, and she was 14 years old with long auburn hair, hazel eyes, and a quiet intensity that made teachers notice her writing talent. She loved reading poetry, walking along the harbor taking photographs with her Canon camera, and writing in her leather-bound diary that she carried everywhere, filling pages with observations about life, school, and dreams of becoming a journalist someday. Every day Rebecca walked to school with her younger sister Jennifer, who was 11, and the 2 girls would leave home at 7:30 in the morning, cutting through Harbor Park and arriving at school by 7:50 for first period. Martha Hayes, Rebecca's mother, worked as a librarian at the Camden Public Library, and Daniel Hayes, her father, was a boat builder who owned a small workshop near the harbor where he crafted wooden sailboats using traditional methods. On Tuesday, October 16, 1990, Rebecca left home at the usual time carrying her backpack, her camera around her neck, and her diary tucked into her jacket pocket, and Jennifer walked beside her talking about a history test. They reached Harbor Park at 7:35, and Rebecca told Jennifer to go ahead because she wanted to take photographs of the boats in the morning light. And Jennifer hesitated, but Rebecca insisted she would catch up before the first bell. Jennifer walked on toward school, looking back once to see her sister standing at the harbor wall with her camera raised, framing a shot of a fishing boat with the sunrise behind it. And that was the last time anyone saw Rebecca Hayes. When Rebecca did not arrive for first period English class, her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, marked her absent. But when second period passed, and Rebecca still had not appeared, the office called home, and Martha answered saying Rebecca had left at the normal time. Martha immediately called the school back, asking them to find Jennifer to confirm when Rebecca had last been seen, and Jennifer was pulled from class crying, saying she had left Rebecca at the harbor taking photographs of the boats. Martha drove immediately to Harbor Park and found Rebecca's camera lying on the ground near the harbor wall, the lens cap still on, as if Rebecca had been interrupted before taking her photograph, but Rebecca herself was nowhere to be found. Martha's voice grew frantic as she called for her daughter, and other parents and teachers joined the search within minutes, walking along the harbor, checking shops and cafes, asking everyone if they had seen a 14-year-old girl with auburn hair. By 10 o'clock, the Camden Police Department was notified, and officers arrived to take statements from Martha, from Jennifer, from anyone who had been near the harbor that morning, and Detective Frank Morrison took lead on the case, a 30-year veteran. Search dogs were brought in and they picked up Rebecca's scent at the harbor wall, following it down Water Street toward the old cannery building that had been abandoned for years, but the scent disappeared near the loading dock. If this happened in your neighborhood, wouldn't you want to know how it was finally solved? Tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It's incredible to see how far these stories travel. And if you'd like to follow more mysteries finally solved through DNA, consider subscribing to the DNA Archives, where every day we uncover another truth time tried to hide. The investigation expanded quickly, with officers canvassing the neighborhood, checking the few security cameras that existed in 1990, and interviewing everyone who worked near the harbor, including fishermen, shop owners, and employees at the cannery. Rebecca's backpack was found 2 days later in a dumpster behind the cannery, and inside were her school books, notebooks, and pens, but her diary was missing. The leather-bound journal she carried everywhere and wrote in daily was gone. Martha knew Rebecca would never have thrown away her diary. She had been writing in it for 3 years, filling page after page with her thoughts and observations, and she protected it fiercely, never letting anyone read it without permission. The case dominated local news for weeks. Rebecca's school photo appeared on posters throughout Camden and surrounding towns, and volunteers organized searches of the woods and shoreline. But no trace of Rebecca was found beyond her camera and backpack. Detective Morrison interviewed everyone close to Rebecca, including family, friends, teachers, classmates, and neighbors, and everyone described her as responsible, studious, and not someone who would run away or put herself in danger. There had been no arguments at home, no problems at school, no boyfriend troubles, nothing to suggest she had left voluntarily, and her parents were loving and supportive. Her grades were excellent. She had friends and plans for the future. The investigation continued through fall and into winter, with tips coming in, but none leading anywhere. Sightings reported but none confirmed, and as months passed, the case began to cool, not because people stopped caring but because there were no leads. The Hayes family was left with questions that had no answers, with a daughter who had simply vanished between the harbor and school on an October morning, and Detective Morrison kept the case file on his desk, reading through it regularly, looking for something he had missed. Years passed and the Hayes family remained in Camden, unable to leave the place where Rebecca had last been seen, and Martha kept Rebecca's room exactly as it had been, with books on the shelf, photographs on the walls, and the bed made with the quilt Rebecca's grandmother had sewn. Daniel stopped working at his boat shop for months after Rebecca disappeared, unable to focus on craftsmanship when his daughter was missing, and when he finally returned to work he was quieter, more withdrawn, building boats mechanically without the joy he had once felt. Jennifer grew up in the shadow of her sister's disappearance, carrying guilt that she had left Rebecca alone at the harbor, that she had not insisted on staying with her, that she had not protected her older sister the way Rebecca had always protected her. She graduated high school in 1997 and studied psychology at the University of Maine, wanting to understand trauma and loss, wanting to help families cope with grief and uncertainty. And she never stopped thinking about Rebecca, never stopped wondering what had happened. Detective Morrison retired in 2008 after 38 years with the Camden Police Department, and he had worked Rebecca's case for 18 years, following every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. He handed the case file to a younger detective named Paul Hendricks, who was 36, thorough and determined, and Hendricks read through the file multiple times, studying the witness statements, the search reports, and the inventory of Rebecca's belongings. By 2015, Rebecca's case was 25 years old, and Camden had changed with new businesses along the harbor, the old cannery converted into apartments, and a generation of residents who had not been alive when Rebecca disappeared. Detective Hendricks decided to re-examine all the physical evidence that had been stored, including Rebecca's camera and backpack, and he requested that everything be sent to the Maine State Police Crime Lab for analysis using modern DNA technology. The backpack had been processed in 1990 for fingerprints but not for DNA, because the technology was not as advanced then, and Hendricks hoped that touch DNA or other genetic material might have been preserved on the fabric or the straps. The crime lab processed the backpack carefully, swabbing every surface, every zipper pull, every pocket, and they found multiple DNA profiles as expected from an item that had been handled by Rebecca, her family, and the officers who had originally processed it. But when the lab examined the inside pockets more carefully, they found something that had been missed in the original investigation. A single torn page from a diary, folded and wedged into a small interior pocket that was easy to overlook. The page was wrinkled and stained, the ink faded but still readable, and it appeared to be from Rebecca's missing diary based on her handwriting, and the entry was dated October 15, 1990, the day before she disappeared. Cold cases don't stay alive unless people keep remembering them. So if you want more stories like this, cases that seemed forgotten until DNA brought answers, subscribe to the DNA archives and help these stories stay alive. New investigations and discoveries are shared here every day. The entry read, "He keeps watching me. I see him at the harbor when I'm taking photos. He says he's interested in my work, but something feels wrong. I don't know how to tell Mom and Dad without sounding paranoid, but I'm scared." The page had been torn from the diary, the ragged edge suggesting it had been ripped out hastily, and Hendricks realized this was evidence Rebecca had hidden, perhaps sensing danger, perhaps wanting to leave a clue if something happened to her. The lab extracted DNA from the page, and they found Rebecca's DNA on both sides from handling it, but they also found male DNA on the corner of the page, as if someone had grabbed it or touched it, and the profile was unknown, not matching anyone in the family. Hendricks ran the profile through CODIS hoping for a match, and 3 weeks later the system returned a result. Partial but strong enough to investigate, and the profile belonged to a man named Thomas Warren, who was now 68 years old. Warren had been arrested in 2012 for stalking a teenage girl, and his DNA had been entered into the database as part of his booking process, and Hendricks pulled his file feeling his pulse quicken because the name was familiar. Thomas Warren had lived in Camden in 1990. He had been a photographer who owned a small studio on Main Street, and he had been interviewed briefly during the original investigation, because several people mentioned he was often at the harbor taking photographs. Detective Morrison had spoken with him, and Warren said he had not seen Rebecca that morning. He had not been at the harbor. He had been at his studio preparing for a client appointment, and with no evidence to contradict him, Morrison had moved on to other leads. But now, 25 years later, Warren's DNA was on a page from Rebecca's diary, a page where she had written about someone watching her at the harbor, someone who said he was interested in her photography, someone who made her feel scared. Detective Hendricks sat in his office studying Thomas Warren's file, looking at the man's booking photo from 2012 when he had been arrested for stalking, and Warren had been 64 then, gray-haired and unremarkable in appearance, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd. In 1990, Warren had been 42, established in Camden as a professional photographer who specialized in landscape and portrait work, and he had a studio on Main Street where he taught occasional photography classes to teenagers and adults. Hendricks went back through the original case file and found Detective Morrison's interview notes from October 1990, and Warren had been interviewed on October 18th, 2 days after Rebecca disappeared, along with dozens of other people who frequented the harbor. Warren told Morrison he knew Rebecca by sight because she was often at the harbor taking photographs, and he had spoken to her a few times about camera settings and composition, offering professional advice, but he said he had not seen her the morning she disappeared. He said he had been at his studio from 7 in the morning preparing for a wedding client who had an appointment at 9, and he provided the client's name and contact information, and Morrison had verified the appointment, and Warren's alibi seemed solid. But the diary page changed everything. Rebecca had written about someone watching her, someone interested in her photography, and Warren fit that description perfectly, and his DNA was on the page she had hidden in her backpack, the page that described her fear. Hendricks needed to build a stronger case before approaching Warren, and he began investigating Warren's history more thoroughly, looking for any other incidents or complaints that might have been filed against him over the years, any pattern of concerning behavior. He discovered that Warren had been fired from a teaching position at a community college in 1985 for inappropriate behavior toward female students, and several complaints had been filed, but no criminal charges were brought, and Warren had left that job and moved to Camden. In 2006, a parent had complained to police that Warren had been taking photographs of children at a public beach, and when officers questioned him, Warren said he was working on a photography project about childhood, and without evidence of wrongdoing, they let him go. The 2012 stalking arrest involved a 16-year-old girl who had taken a photography class from Warren, and after the class ended, Warren had followed her, appeared at places she frequented, and sent her letters saying he admired her artistic talent. The girl's parents filed a restraining order and Warren was arrested when he violated it, and he pleaded guilty to a misdemeanor stalking charge, received probation, and was required to provide a DNA sample which entered him into the system. Hendricks had enough for a warrant to collect a new DNA sample and to search Warren's current residence, and he obtained both. And on a cold morning in December 2015, he and 3 other officers drove to Warren's address in Rockport, a town 15 miles from Camden. Warren lived in a small cottage near the ocean, and when Hendricks knocked on the door, Warren answered wearing glasses and a cardigan, looking like a retired grandfather, and he showed no visible reaction when Hendricks showed him the warrant and explained they needed to search the property. Warren said he had nothing to hide and they were welcome to search, and he asked what this was about, and Hendricks told him they were investigating the disappearance of Rebecca Hayes from October 1990, and Warren's expression did not change. He said he remembered Rebecca, remembered that she had disappeared, said it was a tragedy, and Hendricks showed him the diary page, the entry about someone watching her at the harbor, and asked if Warren had any idea who Rebecca might have been referring to. Warren read the entry slowly and said he did not know, said Rebecca had never expressed fear to him, said he had only spoken to her a few times about photography in passing, and Hendricks asked if Warren had ever touched Rebecca's diary, ever held it or looked through it. Warren said no, he had never seen her diary, had never touched it, and Hendricks placed the diary page in an evidence bag and said Warren's DNA had been found on it, and Warren's face went pale and he said that was impossible. He had never touched her diary. Officers searched the cottage while Hendricks stayed with Warren, and they went through every room, every closet, every drawer, looking for anything that might connect Warren to Rebecca's disappearance, any photographs, any journals, any evidence he had kept. In Warren's darkroom, which was a converted bedroom with blackout curtains and developing equipment, officers found boxes of old negatives and prints, thousands of photographs organized by date going back to the 1980s, and they began looking through them systematically. In a box labeled Harbor 1989 to 1991, they found photographs of Camden Harbor taken during the years around Rebecca's disappearance, and many of the images included people in the background, fishermen working, tourists walking, and in several photos, Rebecca was visible taking her own photographs. The images showed Rebecca at the harbor wall with her camera, Rebecca sitting on a bench writing in a journal, Rebecca looking at boats, and the photographs were taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, suggesting Warren had been watching her and documenting her without her knowledge. Hendricks looked at the photographs spread across Warren's kitchen table, dozens of images showing Rebecca at the harbor over what appeared to be weeks or months, and some were dated on the back in Warren's handwriting, September through October 1990. The photographs were not casual shots of the harbor that happened to include Rebecca. They were focused on her, zoomed in on her face, her hands holding the camera, her sitting alone writing in her diary, and it was clear Warren had been deliberately photographing her. Hendricks asked Warren why he had taken so many photographs of a 14-year-old girl without her knowledge or permission, and Warren said he was documenting young artists at work, that Rebecca represented youth and creativity, and he had meant no harm. Hendricks said the photographs suggested obsession, not documentation, and combined with the diary entry about someone watching her and Warren's DNA on the torn page, there was clear evidence of concerning behavior at minimum, and Warren needed to explain how his DNA got on that page. Warren sat silent for several minutes, his hands folded on the table, and then he said he wanted a lawyer and would not answer any more questions, and Hendricks arrested him on charges of stalking related to the photographs and the diary entry. They transported Warren to the Knox County Sheriff's Office, and Hendricks collected a new DNA sample to confirm the match with the profile from the diary page, and the sample was sent to the crime lab with a request for expedited processing. Hendricks called Martha and Daniel Hayes and told them there had been a development in Rebecca's case, and he asked if they could come to the station, and when they arrived he showed them the diary page, the photographs Warren had taken, and told them about the DNA match. Martha read the diary entry through tears, recognizing Rebecca's handwriting, reading her daughter's fear written the day before she disappeared, and she said Rebecca had never mentioned feeling watched or scared, had never said anything about the photographer. Daniel asked if Hendricks believed Warren had taken Rebecca, and Hendricks said the evidence strongly suggested it, but they needed Warren to tell them what happened, to tell them where Rebecca was, and Warren was refusing to talk without a lawyer present. The DNA results came back 2 weeks later, confirming the match. Thomas Warren's DNA was definitively on the torn diary page, and the lab estimated based on degradation that the DNA had been deposited around the same time period as Rebecca's disappearance. Warren's lawyer, a public defender named Patricia Mills, reviewed the evidence and told Warren he was facing serious charges, and while the DNA and photographs did not prove murder, they proved stalking and obsession, and if Rebecca's remains were found, he would likely face additional charges. Mills advised Warren that cooperating and providing information about Rebecca's location would be viewed favorably by prosecutors and might result in a lesser sentence. But Warren maintained he had nothing to confess because he had not harmed Rebecca. Hendricks obtained a warrant to search Warren's photography studio from 1990, which was now a coffee shop, but the landlord had stored some items from previous tenants in the basement, and among those items were boxes belonging to Warren that he had abandoned when he closed the studio. Inside the boxes were more photographs, business records, and old equipment, and in one box wrapped in cloth was a leather-bound diary with Rebecca Hayes' name written inside the front cover, her missing diary that had been sought for 25 years. The diary contained entries from 1987 through October 15, 1990, the day before Rebecca disappeared, and the final entries described her growing fear of the photographer who watched her at the harbor, who had started leaving notes for her, who made her uncomfortable. She wrote about finding a note tucked under her camera bag that said, "You have a gift, I want to help you develop it." And she wrote about another note that said, "I watch you work, you're special." And she wrote that she was scared to tell her parents because she thought they would not let her go to the harbor alone anymore. The last entry, dated October 15th, said she had decided to tear out the page describing her fear and hide it in her backpack. And if anything happened to her, someone would find it and know who to look for. And that act of self-protection had indeed preserved the evidence. 20 years later, one overlooked fragment changed everything, and that's what we explore here. The moment science meets persistence. So if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss the next story where DNA finally tells the truth. A new case drops every day on the DNA archives. With the diary as evidence, Hendricks confronted Warren again, and this time Warren's lawyer was present, and Hendricks placed the diary on the table between them, and Warren's face showed recognition and something that might have been fear or resignation. Hendricks said they had found Rebecca's diary and Warren's stored belongings, and that constituted possession of evidence from a missing person case. And combined with the stalking behavior documented in the diary and the photographs, Warren was facing multiple felony charges. Mills spoke quietly with Warren for several minutes, and then Warren said he would provide a statement, that he wanted to tell what happened, but he insisted it had been an accident, that he had never meant to hurt Rebecca. Warren said he had been at the harbor that morning of October 16th, taking photographs as he often did, and he saw Rebecca standing at the harbor wall with her camera, and he approached her to talk about photography, to offer advice and encouragement as he had done before. But Rebecca had been different that morning, tense and uncomfortable, and when Warren moved closer, she had backed away and told him to leave her alone, and Warren said he was only trying to help her, to mentor her talent, but Rebecca said she did not want his help. She said she knew he had been watching her, following her, leaving notes for her, and she told him to stay away or she would tell her parents and the police, and Warren said he panicked because he could not afford another complaint, another investigation, another incident on his record. He said Rebecca turned to walk away and he grabbed her arm, tried to explain that she was misunderstanding his intentions, and Rebecca pulled away and started to run toward Water Street, and Warren followed her because he needed to make her understand, needed to convince her not to report him. He caught up with her near the old cannery building where the loading dock provided cover from the street, and Rebecca was scared, crying, saying she would scream if he did not let her go, and Warren covered her mouth to keep her quiet, just for a moment, just to talk to her. But Rebecca struggled, fought against him, and Warren said his hand pressed too hard against her mouth and nose. He was trying to calm her down, but she could not breathe, and by the time he realized what was happening, she had stopped moving, stopped struggling, and he laid her on the ground. He said he checked for a pulse but could not find one, checked for breathing but she was not breathing, and he panicked completely, understanding that Rebecca was dead and he had killed her, and he did not know what to do except hide what he had done. He wrapped her in a tarp from the cannery dock and carried her to his van, which was parked nearby, and he drove north along Route 1 toward Lincolnville, toward a wooded area where he sometimes went to photograph nature and wildlife, a remote place rarely visited by hikers. He buried Rebecca in the woods near a stream, covering the grave with leaves and branches, and then he drove back to Camden, to his studio, arriving just minutes before his 9 o'clock appointment, and he went through the motions of photographing a wedding client while Rebecca lay buried in the forest. Later that day, when police began searching for Rebecca, Warren joined other concerned citizens in looking, pretending to help while knowing exactly where she was, and when Detective Morrison interviewed him, Warren lied, gave an alibi, and acted like a helpful community member. He kept Rebecca's diary because he could not risk throwing it away where someone might find it, and he kept the photographs he had taken of her because destroying them felt like erasing evidence of her artistic spirit, and he told himself he was preserving her memory even as he knew he had taken her life. Hendricks asked where exactly Rebecca was buried, and Warren described the location in detail, a wooded area off Route 1 about 3 miles past Lincolnville Beach, near an old logging road, approximately 100 yards from where the stream crossed under the road. He said he could draw a map or take officers there if needed, and Hendricks said yes, they would need him to show them the exact location, and Warren nodded slowly as if relieved that the secret he had carried for 25 years was finally being released. A search team was organized and Warren was transported to the area he described, and with his hands shackled he led officers into the woods, following the stream, and after about 10 minutes he stopped at a clearing and pointed to a spot beneath a large pine tree. He said that was where he had buried Rebecca, and the team began to excavate carefully, removing layers of soil and decomposed leaves, and 3 feet down they found fabric, the remnants of the tarp Warren had described, and beneath it were bones, small and fragile, a teenage girl's skeleton. The remains were transported to the state medical examiner's office, and forensic analysis confirmed through dental records that they belonged to Rebecca Hayes, and she had been there for 25 years, less than 30 miles from home, buried in the woods while her family searched and hoped. Detective Hendricks called Martha and Daniel Hayes and told them they had found Rebecca, told them she was coming home, and Martha made a sound that was part sob and part something else. Relief mixed with devastation. The end of hope mixed with the finality of knowing. Daniel asked if she had suffered, and Hendricks said based on Warren's confession it had been quick, though that provided little comfort, and he said Warren was in custody and would face murder charges, and the Hayes family would finally have justice after 25 years. Jennifer flew home from where she was living in Boston, and the three of them sat together in the house on Elm Street, in Rebecca's unchanged bedroom, holding each other and crying for the girl who had walked to the harbor with her camera and never came home. The funeral was held in November 2015, 25 years after Rebecca disappeared, and the service was at the Camden Congregational Church where the Hayes family had attended when Rebecca was alive, where Rebecca had sung in the youth choir and helped with holiday programs. The sanctuary was full of people who had known Rebecca, who had searched for her, who had never forgotten her, and there were also people from the newer generation who had only known her story, but felt compelled to honor her memory and support her family. The casket was closed and covered with white roses and autumn leaves, colors that represented both innocence and the season when Rebecca had been taken, and Pastor Williams spoke about loss, about the cruelty of violence, about faith that persists even when understanding fails. Martha sat in the front pew holding Daniel's hand, and she thought about the last time she had seen Rebecca, kissing her goodbye that October morning, watching her leave with Jennifer, never imagining that would be their final moment together. She thought about the diary page Rebecca had hidden, the final act of a scared girl who was smart enough to leave evidence, who was brave enough to name her fear even when she could not prevent what happened, and Martha was grateful for that page because it had finally revealed the truth. After the service, they drove to Mountain View Cemetery, where a plot had been prepared on a hillside overlooking Penobscot Bay, the water Rebecca had loved to photograph, the harbor where she had spent so many mornings capturing light and boats and the beauty of coastal Maine. The headstone was simple gray granite with Rebecca's name, her birth and death years, and the inscription, "Artist, daughter, sister, forever loved," and beneath that was an engraved image of a camera, honoring the passion that had defined Rebecca's short life. Daniel placed Rebecca's camera on the grave, the Canon that had been found at the harbor wall 25 years earlier, and Jennifer placed the diary beside it, the leather-bound journal that had preserved Rebecca's final thoughts and fears, and they stood together in silence. Thomas Warren was charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping and tampering with evidence, and his lawyer advised him to plead not guilty, to argue that Rebecca's death had been accidental, that he had not intended to kill her, only to silence her temporarily. But Warren surprised everyone by refusing that advice, and in January 2016, he entered a guilty plea to all charges, saying he did not want the Hayes family to endure a trial, did not want Rebecca's diary read aloud in court, did not want to put them through more pain. The courtroom was packed for the sentencing hearing, and Martha, Daniel, and Jennifer sat in the front row, and Warren stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, looking older than his 69 years, and for the first time since his arrest, he looked directly at the Hayes family. He said he was sorry, that he had spent 25 years thinking about what he had done, that he had told himself it was an accident but he knew he was responsible, that his obsession with Rebecca had led to her death, and nothing he could say would make it right. Martha stared at him without blinking, and when the judge asked if she wanted to make a victim impact statement, she stood and walked to the podium, and she spoke clearly and firmly, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. She said Warren had not just taken Rebecca's life, he had taken 25 years from their family, 25 years of not knowing, of hoping she was alive, of imagining she would come home, and he had stolen Rebecca's future, all the art she would have created, all the stories she would have written. She said Warren had stolen Jennifer's sister, had forced Jennifer to grow up with guilt and grief, and he had destroyed the family they had been, turning them into people defined by loss and uncertainty, And while his confession and guilty plea mattered, nothing could give them back what he had taken. The judge sentenced Warren to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Warren was led away in handcuffs without looking back, and the Hayes family walked out of the courthouse into the cold January air, and they drove home in silence. The days after the sentencing were strange. The question that had consumed their lives for 25 years was answered, but the answer brought no peace, only confirmation of what they had feared, that Rebecca had suffered, that she had been taken by someone she knew, that her final moments had been filled with terror. Daniel returned to his boat shop but found it difficult to focus on his work. The craftsmanship that had once brought him joy now felt meaningless, and he moved through his days mechanically, building boats because it was what he knew how to do, not because it mattered anymore. Martha returned to her position at the library, but requested reduced hours, and she spent more time at the cemetery, visiting Rebecca's grave several times a week, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the bench nearby, talking to her daughter about everything and nothing. Jennifer struggled with survivor's guilt, feeling that she should have stayed with Rebecca that morning, should have insisted on walking with her to school, should have protected her the way an older sister would have, even though Rebecca had been the older sister, not her. She returned to Boston but found herself unable to concentrate on her work, unable to sleep through the night, haunted by images of Rebecca at the harbor, by the knowledge of what had happened after Jennifer walked away, and she began seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma and grief. The years moved forward and Camden changed as coastal towns do, with new shops replacing old ones, new residents moving in while longtime families moved away. But those who remembered Rebecca Hayes kept her story alive through the memorial fund established in her name. The Rebecca Hayes Arts Scholarship was created by Martha and Daniel in 2016, providing funding for young photographers and writers to pursue their artistic dreams, ensuring Rebecca's passion for creativity would continue to inspire and support others even after her death. Every year, the scholarship supported 3 students from Camden Hills High School, and recipients were chosen based on portfolios of photography or writing that demonstrated the same artistic vision and dedication Rebecca had shown, and each recipient received Rebecca's camera as inspiration during their senior year. The camera was passed from student to student year after year, becoming a symbol of artistic legacy and the importance of nurturing young talent, and each student who held it learned Rebecca's story, learned about the girl who had loved photography and had been taken too soon. Detective Hendricks continued working cold cases, and Rebecca's case became his most significant achievement, not because it was the most complex, but because it demonstrated the importance of re-examining old evidence with new technology. And he trained other detectives using her case as a primary example. He taught them about the torn diary page, about how Rebecca had been smart enough to hide evidence knowing she was in danger, about how touch DNA had survived on that page for 25 years, and about how persistence and modern forensic science had finally brought justice. The diary page itself was preserved in the evidence room at the Camden Police Department, displayed in a climate-controlled case alongside Rebecca's photograph, and it served as a teaching tool for investigators, a reminder that victims sometimes leave clues, and those clues deserve to be found and understood. Thomas Warren remained in prison at the Maine State Prison in Warren, and he did not appeal his sentence, did not request any hearings or reviews, and he worked in the prison library organizing books and helping other inmates with literacy programs, living quietly and without incident. Other inmates knew what he had done, knew he had killed a teenage girl, and child predators were not popular in prison, but Warren was elderly and non-threatening, and he existed on the margins, serving his time in isolation from most social interactions. He received no visitors, no letters from family or friends, and the only correspondence he maintained was with a victims' rights organization that documented his case as part of a study on delayed justice, and Warren participated because he said he wanted his story to serve as a warning. He wrote that obsession was a poison, that his fixation on Rebecca's talent had twisted into something dark, that he had told himself he was mentoring her when really he was stalking her, and he had not recognized the danger he posed until it was too late. Martha Hayes continued her weekly visits to the cemetery, and as she aged and her mobility decreased, Daniel would drive her there and sit with her on the bench, and they would talk about Rebecca, about memories from before she disappeared, about the life she should have lived. They talked about grandchildren Rebecca would never have, about the journalism career she had dreamed of, about the photographs she would have taken, and the stories she would have written, and they allowed themselves to imagine the woman she would have become at 40, at 50, at 60. Daniel died in 2023 from complications of pneumonia. He was 79 years old, and his death was sudden, and Martha lost not only her husband, but her partner in grief, the only person who truly understood what those 25 years of not knowing had felt like. Jennifer moved back to Camden to be with her mother, and she took a position as a school counselor at Camden Hills High School, working with teenagers who struggled with anxiety and trauma, and she used her own experience to help them understand that survival was possible, even after devastating loss. She visited Rebecca's grave regularly with her mother, and they would sit together in silence or talk about Daniel, about how he was with Rebecca now, about how the three of them were together again while Martha and Jennifer carried on, honoring their memory by living. The impact of Rebecca's case extended beyond Camden, as police departments across Maine and New England began re-examining cold cases where personal items like diaries, letters, or journals had been recovered, understanding that these objects might contain DNA evidence that had been overlooked decades earlier. In Vermont, a case from 1987 was solved when a letter found in a victim's pocket was retested for DNA, revealing a profile that matched a convicted offender in the database, and the case was solved 36 years after the crime, inspired by Rebecca's diary page. In New Hampshire, a case from 1992 was solved when investigators re-examined a notebook that had been found near a crime scene, and DNA extracted from the paper led to an arrest, and another family received answers after waiting over 30 years, and they credited Rebecca's case with inspiring the breakthrough. Detective Paul Hendricks retired in 2030 after 22 years with the Camden Police Department, and Rebecca's case remained his most important work, the case that defined his career and taught him that evidence could speak across decades if investigators were willing to listen. On his last day, Hendricks visited Rebecca's grave at Mountain View Cemetery, bringing white roses and standing there for a long time, thinking about the 14-year-old girl who had been smart enough to hide a page from her diary, who had left evidence that would eventually solve her own case. He thought about Martha Hayes, who had preserved Rebecca's backpack for 25 years, not knowing it contained the crucial evidence, about Jennifer, who had lived with guilt for decades, and about Daniel, who had died without seeing Warren face justice but knowing the truth. Hendricks had learned from Rebecca's case that victims were often more aware of danger than anyone realized, that they left clues and warnings that deserved to be taken seriously, and he had trained dozens of detectives to look for those signs, to listen to those warnings even when they came from beyond the grave. The torn diary page became famous in forensic circles, featured in academic papers about evidence preservation, discussed at conferences about cold case investigation, and used in training programs to demonstrate how personal writings could contain both narrative evidence and physical DNA evidence. Forensic scientists studied the case to understand how DNA had survived on paper for 25 years, what conditions had preserved it, and how extraction techniques could be optimized for similar items, and their research improved methods for processing documents, letters, and journals in other cases. The Rebecca Hayes case was featured in a documentary called Words That Waited, that aired in 2031, and it detailed her life, her artistic talent, her disappearance, the 25-year search, and the diary page that finally revealed her killer's identity. Martha agreed to participate, her only on-camera interview, and she spoke about Rebecca not as a victim but as a talented young artist who loved photography and writing, who had dreams of becoming a journalist, who had been taken by someone who pretended to mentor her but was actually stalking her. She emphasized the importance of teaching young people to trust their instincts, to speak up when someone made them uncomfortable, to tell parents and teachers when they felt unsafe, and she said Rebecca had been scared, but had not known how to ask for help without seeming paranoid. The documentary included excerpts from Rebecca's diary with Martha's permission, passages that showed Rebecca's observations about life, her artistic vision, her sense of humor, and finally the entries that documented her growing fear of the photographer who watched her at the harbor. Viewers learned about Thomas Warren's pattern of concerning behavior, about how he had inserted himself into situations with young women and girls under the guise of mentorship, about how his obsession with Rebecca had escalated from watching to leaving notes to confrontation and murder. The documentary sparked conversations about predatory behavior disguised as mentorship, about how parents and educators could recognize warning signs, about the importance of creating environments where young people felt safe reporting uncomfortable situations without fear of overreacting or being dismissed. Thomas Warren was interviewed for the documentary from prison, and he spoke about his actions with what seemed like remorse, saying he had destroyed Rebecca's life and his own, that his inability to accept rejection and his need to control had led to tragedy. He said he hoped his story would serve as a warning about obsession and the danger of men who used positions of authority or expertise to gain access to young people. And he acknowledged that his apology meant nothing, that Rebecca was still dead and her family still suffered because of what he had done. Martha watched the documentary once sitting alone in her living room, and when Warren appeared on screen she felt nothing, no anger or hatred or satisfaction, just emptiness, and she turned off the television before his segment ended because she did not want to hear his voice. Jennifer watched it with her colleagues at the high school counseling department, and they discussed how to use it as a teaching tool for students, how to talk about recognizing dangerous situations, about trusting instincts, about the difference between appropriate mentorship and predatory grooming. She spoke to students about her sister, about how Rebecca had been smart and talented and cautious, but had still been victimized because predators are skilled at manipulation, and she emphasized that being afraid or uncomfortable was valid, that seeking help was strength, not weakness. The Camden Police Department created a youth safety program called Rebecca's Voice in 2032, teaching teenagers about recognizing predatory behavior, about documenting concerning interactions, about reporting safely to trusted adults, and about understanding that their safety was more important than being polite. The program was taught in schools throughout Knox County, and it included information about how to journal or document situations that made them uncomfortable, how to preserve evidence if they felt threatened, and how to seek help from multiple sources if one adult dismissed their concerns. Martha volunteered with the program despite her advanced age, speaking to students about Rebecca, about the warning signs that had been present but not recognized, about the importance of listening when young people expressed fear or discomfort about an adult's behavior. She showed students the photograph of Rebecca at 14, smiling and holding her camera, full of life and dreams, and she said predators counted on silence, on young people being afraid to speak up, on adults dismissing concerns as overreaction, and breaking that silence could save lives. The program reached thousands of students in its first 5 years, and school counselors reported increased reporting of uncomfortable interactions with adults, situations that were investigated and in several cases led to intervention before escalation, and the program was credited with preventing potential tragedies. The town of Camden erected a permanent memorial for Rebecca in 2033 at Harbor Park, where she had last been seen. A bronze sculpture of a young woman with a camera standing at the harbor wall, looking out at the water, capturing a moment of beauty and possibility. The sculpture was unveiled on October 16th, the 43rd anniversary of Rebecca's disappearance, and hundreds of people gathered for the ceremony, including Martha, who was now 89 years old and in a wheelchair, and Jennifer, who stood beside her with tears streaming down her face. Mayor Richardson spoke about Rebecca's legacy, about how her story had changed Camden's approach to youth safety, about how the scholarship in her name had supported dozens of young artists, about how her voice continued to teach and protect even decades after her death. Martha was invited to speak but declined because her health was failing and she tired easily. But she had written a statement that Jennifer read on her behalf, thanking the community for never forgetting Rebecca, for honoring her memory, for turning tragedy into education and prevention. The statement said that while Martha would never stop grieving for the daughter who was taken, she found meaning in knowing Rebecca's story had helped other families, had taught young people to trust their instincts, had shown that victims often knew they were in danger and tried to protect themselves. After the ceremony, people lined up to place flowers at the base of the sculpture, and photographers, both amateur and professional, took pictures, and the image of the memorial appeared in newspapers and on social media, spreading Rebecca's story to new audiences who had never heard of her. The sculpture became a gathering place for the artistic community in Camden, with photography students visiting to pay respects and draw inspiration, with writers coming to sit on the benches nearby and work on their craft, and with parents bringing children to teach them about safety and awareness. Martha Hayes died peacefully in her sleep in March 2034 at the age of 90, 44 years after Rebecca disappeared, and Jennifer found her in the morning with a photograph of Rebecca on her chest, the same photo that had appeared on missing person posters in 1990. The funeral was held at Camden Congregational Church, and the sanctuary was full of people whose lives Martha had touched through her advocacy work, her scholarship fund, and her example of how to transform grief into purpose, and Pastor Williams spoke about her strength and dedication. Jennifer delivered the eulogy, talking about her mother's love for Rebecca, about the 25 years she waited for answers, about the 19 years after justice was served that she spent honoring Rebecca's memory, and about how she had never let Rebecca be forgotten or reduced to just a victim. Martha was buried at Mountain View Cemetery beside Daniel and Rebecca, 3 graves in a row on the hillside overlooking Penobscot Bay, and the 3 headstones formed a family reunited in death. And Martha's stone included the inscription, "Devoted Mother, Tireless Advocate, at Peace." Jennifer stood at the graves after everyone else had left, looking at the 3 names, her father, her sister, her mother, and she thought about how one October morning had shattered their family, how they had spent decades trying to understand and heal, how they had never fully recovered. She thought about the diary page Rebecca had torn and hidden, about how her sister's final act of self-protection had waited 25 years to speak, about how DNA had survived on paper when so many other things had been lost, about how science and persistence had finally revealed the truth. Thomas Warren died in prison in August 2035 from heart failure. He was 89 years old, and there was no funeral, no service, no public acknowledgement, just a notation in prison records that he had died, and his body had been cremated. His ashes were held for the required 60 days, and when no one claimed them, they were disposed of according to state protocol, and the world moved on without marking his passing, and his name faded from memory, except as the man who killed Rebecca Hayes. The contrast was stark between how Rebecca was remembered through sculptures and scholarships and documentaries, and how Warren disappeared without trace or tribute, and that seemed right to everyone who knew the story, that victims should be honored while perpetrators should be forgotten. Jennifer continued working as a school counselor at Camden Hills High School, and she made it her mission to talk openly with students about her sister, about recognizing danger, about the importance of documenting concerns and seeking help, and she saved several students from potentially dangerous situations. She never married, never had children of her own, but she considered the hundreds of students she counseled to be her legacy, her way of honoring Rebecca by protecting other young people, by giving them the tools and support Rebecca had needed, but not received. The Rebecca Hayes Art Scholarship continued operating, and by 2036 it had supported over 60 students in pursuing photography and writing, and many of those students went on to successful careers in journalism, fine art photography, and creative writing, carrying Rebecca's passion forward. Each recipient learned Rebecca's story, understood that the scholarship existed because a talented 14-year-old girl had been killed by someone who claimed to admire her art, and they treated the opportunity with reverence, knowing it represented a life that had been stolen and dreams that had been destroyed. The torn diary page remained in its climate-controlled case at the Camden Police Department, and new officers were brought to see it during training, learning about the importance of personal writings as evidence, about how DNA could survive on paper, about how victims often documented their own cases without realizing it. Jennifer Hayes retired from counseling in 2042 after 28 years helping students navigate trauma and anxiety, and she had saved countless young people from dangerous situations by teaching them to recognize warning signs and trust their instincts, lessons learned from her sister's death. On her last day of work, she visited Rebecca's memorial at Harbor Park, bringing white roses and standing before the bronze sculpture, and she remembered the morning Rebecca had stopped to photograph the boats, the morning Jennifer had walked ahead to school, the last time she saw her sister alive. She had spent 52 years living with the guilt of that choice, of leaving Rebecca alone, and therapy had helped her understand she bore no responsibility for what happened, that the guilt belonged only to Thomas Warren, but the feelings never fully disappeared, only became manageable. She thought about the diary page Rebecca had hidden, about how her sister had been smart and brave enough to leave evidence even while afraid, about how that torn page had waited a quarter century in a backpack pocket until technology advanced enough to read its secrets. She thought about her mother who had preserved that backpack not knowing it contained the key to everything, about her father who had died before seeing justice, about Detective Hendricks who had refused to let the case remain unsolved, about all the pieces that had aligned to bring truth. The years continued to pass and Camden kept growing, and new generations learned about Rebecca Hayes in school programs and through the scholarship that bore her name, and the story became part of the town's history, a reminder of loss and justice, and the importance of listening when young people expressed fear. The bronze sculpture at Harbor Park became one of Camden's most recognizable landmarks, photographed by tourists and locals alike, and many visitors did not know the full story, but were drawn to the image of the young woman with the camera, capturing beauty and possibility. Those who did know the story often left flowers or notes at the base, messages saying Rebecca's voice had helped them recognize danger, had given them courage to speak up, had shown them that documenting fear was not paranoia, but self-protection, and the memorial became a place of reflection and resolve. The science that solved Rebecca's case continued to evolve with new methods for extracting DNA from paper, fabric, and other materials that had previously been considered too degraded or contaminated, and cold cases across the country were being solved using techniques pioneered by the forensic scientists who had processed Rebecca's diary page. In Massachusetts, a case from 1988 was solved when DNA was extracted from a birthday card found at a crime scene, and the profile matched a suspect who had been interviewed and cleared decades earlier, and another family received answers after 38 years of waiting. In Ohio, a case from 1993 was solved when investigators retested a journal entry found in a victim's home, and DNA on the paper led to an arrest, and the investigator credited Rebecca's case with inspiring them to re-examine written evidence that had been overlooked for years. Detective Paul Hendricks died in his sleep in 2045 at the age of 86, and his obituary highlighted his distinguished career, and particularly his work on the Rebecca Hayes case, noting that his persistence had brought closure to a family after 25 years of uncertainty. Jennifer attended his funeral and spoke about how Hendricks had given her family the gift of truth, how he had refused to accept that Rebecca's case was unsolvable, how he had used new technology to examine old evidence, and how his dedication had taught her that justice was possible even when it seemed impossible. She said Hendricks had shown her what it meant to care about the families behind case files, to treat victims as people, not just numbers, to fight for answers even when decades had passed, and she thanked him for bringing Rebecca home, and for ensuring Warren faced consequences for what he had done. The torn diary page that solved the case was eventually transferred to the Maine State Police Crime Lab Museum, where it was displayed alongside other significant pieces of forensic evidence, and it became one of the most visited exhibits, drawing students, investigators, and families affected by cold cases. Visitors could read the transcription of Rebecca's final entry, could see the analysis that had extracted Warren's DNA from the corner of the page, could learn about the investigation that had connected those dots, and many left the museum determined to support cold case units and forensic advancement. Jennifer Hayes lived until 2051, dying peacefully at the age of 72, surrounded by former students who had become like family, young people she had counseled and protected, who had grown into adults, and never forgot the woman who had taught them to value their safety and trust their instincts. She was buried at Mountain View Cemetery beside Martha, Daniel, and Rebecca, 4 graves in a row on the hillside, and her headstone read, "Beloved sister, dedicated counselor, guardian of Rebecca's legacy," and students placed cameras and journals on her grave, honoring both sisters who had shaped their understanding of art and safety. The story reminds us that time doesn't erase truth, it only delays it. And if stories like this move you, if you want to see more forgotten cases finally solved through DNA and advancing technology, subscribe to the DNA Archives, where new stories are shared every day. It's free and it helps these stories reach more people who still believe in justice after decades of silence. Because families deserve answers, and evidence deserves to be heard no matter how many years pass or how carefully secrets are hidden. Rebecca Hayes was 14 years old when she disappeared from Camden Harbor. She loved photography and poetry, and dreamed of becoming a journalist. She had auburn hair and hazel eyes and a talent that was recognized by everyone who knew her. And though her future was stolen, her voice endured. Not as a tragedy alone, but as a testament to awareness and self-protection, as proof that written words contain both narrative and physical evidence, as inspiration for investigators to re-examine old materials with new technology, and as a legacy that taught thousands of young people to trust their fear and document their concerns. Her torn diary page captured more than her final thoughts. It captured her killer's DNA, and that page waited 25 years in a backpack pocket until someone looked closely enough to find it. And in the end, the truth emerged, as it always does, patient and persistent, waiting in torn paper and faded ink for someone to listen to what it had to say.